Okay, everybody, it's a little afternoon. All of our guests and all of our employees here. We'll go ahead and start this meeting off, and we'll do a quick safety briefing. First of all, if anybody has got some lunch, has something to drink, clean that in the back. Just want to welcome everybody to our stakeholder meeting today for the Integrated Resource Plan. I'm Ricky Erickson. I'm the VP of Electric Systems. I'm here to do the safety briefing. So we'll run through that real quick, and then we'll turn it over to our team. So for our, in case of emergency, the security will be called 911. I want to make sure they coordinate all that for any evacuation. Our new emergency evacuation route, we have two stairwells. We have one over here in the corner. As you exit this door here, it's right over in the corner. Big exit sign on it. There's another one over here by the elevator, just to the right of the elevator. So two stairways in case of an emergency. Our assembly location is James Weldon Johnson Park, formerly known as Senate Plaza, right in front of the City Hall there. That's where we're assembled in case of emergency. Any safety or medical issues, please let us know. We'll make sure security knows about those as well. Watch for your hazards if we have to exit. Chairs, tables are the main hazards. Some cords over here, some cords up here, but just be careful and wary of the hazards as you exit the room in case you need to. Also, as a meeting etiquette, cell phones, please have them on silent, if you would please. We also have things to do, but we'll keep them on silent versus ringer. And with that, I'll turn it to any questions for the safety briefing. All right, with that, I'll turn it over to Ray.
Thank you, Ricky. Okay. Y'all can hear me okay? So welcome, everyone. I'm Ray Marshall, Chief Operating Officer for JEA. And welcome everyone to our, believe it or not, this is our seventh stakeholder meeting. As we were prepping for this meeting, I was looking back and it's been about a year. I think about a year since we had our very first stakeholder meeting. So we're very appreciative of your participation, of your willingness to hang in there and also for your input. So for this particular meeting, for the agenda slide, I can just go over it real briefly here. But before I do, this is a very important, as everyone knows, topic for JEA, for our board, and for the community. We will have a guest today, which is our vice chair of our board, Marty Lenahan, who will be joining us later on at this meeting.
So you could just be on your best behavior for us.
So of course, we welcome her. And as we always do, are there any new stakeholders? Is this your very first meeting? If so, we want to have the opportunity to welcome you, whether you are here in person or virtually. Do we have anyone new first time? Okay, all right, very good. So as far as the agenda is concerned, Laura and Countries are going to do a review of our last meeting, which was very data intensive, but it's been about 2 months, so it's always good to do a recap of that. And then Brad Kushner, who you have never heard from before. Brad is going to go over the scenarios which you have seen before, but since the last time that we have met, there's been some sensitivity analysis that's been done. Brad is going to introduce that information to us. Pedro Melendez is going to go over our near-term implementation plan, put into context what we're seeing from the IRP modeling results and what that kind of means to JEA. And then last but certainly not least, Jay has been at each and every one of our stakeholder meetings, but he is on the agenda for this meeting because he's going to take this and talk about next steps. How do we take all the input that we have, whether from the modeling results, from the valuable input that you have given us, and moving forward. So putting all of that together. So it's a pretty good, I'm not going to say ambitious agenda. And at each one of our meetings, or this stakeholder meetings, it's just like everyone, we want this to be as interactive as possible. I don't think anybody's shy as far as giving their input or asking questions, but please feel free to do that, whether you're here or whether you're virtual. So unless there's any questions, I'm now going to turn it over to Lauren Hendricks.
All right, thank you, Ray. We can begin anywhere.
Well, thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate the time that you guys have spent with us and the sharing of information so that we could get this IRP information correctly done. So in November, we spent, as Ray mentioned, about 2.5 hours together over at the Conservation Center building. So it was a nice opportunity for us to branch out a little bit. We had some very special guests at that meeting. We had a member of the local press there, so we're getting some press coverage, which is always good. And during this meeting, we had the initial debut of the models and thoughts about the 6 scenarios, and those included the supplemental scenarios contributed by the St. John's Riverkeeper, Sierra Club, and others who've been very engaged in the process, so we certainly do appreciate your participation.
I actually watched the WebEx recording from November. Some of us were talking before that started today. That was only 2.5 months ago, but it seems like it was a much longer time ago. And it refreshed my memory about how many questions this group asked, how much answers were exchanged. It was a really robust discussion, particularly about generation resources and carbon emission considerations. And as Patrice said, we also did present in November an optional add-on to the meeting, and several of you stayed and did a really deep dive with Paul Maxwell into the data that the model has been crunching on. So I hope the various graphics that we presented in November helped make it easier for you to see the computational work that the model is doing. We've worked hard on those graphics for this meeting to make them even more approachable. So today, as Ray previewed, Brad and the team they're ready to move ahead and show you the additional work that the model has been performing with help from its human operators and caretakers. Thank you again for being part of this journey. It's amazing to look back and think that we've been together working on this for a year. More work lies ahead. Today's an important discussion, and we do have a lot of time for discussion. So factors and scenarios and sensitivities and considerations, they're all on the table today. So let's get started. Brad, welcome.
Thank you, Kentrice, Laura, Ricky. Good afternoon. Good to see everybody again. Appreciate you being here. Paul and Brian are with us again over here. As with previous meetings, we've got plenty of subject matter experts throughout the room. Open discussion, please. Whatever questions, comments you have, we'll take them as they go on. Dr. Lucy, we got some questions from you in advance. We appreciate those. We'll address those throughout the presentation, and certainly if we don't get to it in the level of detail you're looking for, we can take them up at any point. So please don't be shy and ask for more information if we're not getting you what you need. In terms of what we did, next slide, please, back in November, it does seem like a while ago, and it was very data intensive, put a lot of information out, not just detail, but also kind of what this means for JDA, what it means for the community. What are the trends that we're seeing within the analysis? I hope you all by now recognize that we're going beyond what the model says, right? So when we talk about modeling results, that's one component of it. I think we sort of introduced that early on in the process, that there's a lot of human interaction here. It's not just this is what the model says, this is what the model says. So you'll probably get tired of us hearing us say that throughout the presentation, but it's really a critical component of why we're all together. If it was just a model in, model out, there wouldn't be a need for this sort of interaction. So since November, the refinement of the solar photovoltaic PV costs, I think we introduced the concept of how we have within the service territory of JEA, and then you kind of get outside and different levels of tiers of solar, there's different cost implications. Transmission costs being one component. So since November, we've refined the estimates of the cost to get to this first tier of solar, which is nominally about 300 megawatts or so within the service territory of JEA. And that increased. It was about a 15% overall project cost increase due to transmission system improvements that would be necessary. Important to note, not to skip too far ahead though, is the themes that we talked about at the last stakeholder meeting about how solar fits in the JEA system. That wasn't affected by this change in cost. So we are looking at, and that's part of the reason we do this. As we get further on in the analysis, we learn more about the system. We try to keep as current as we can to see if there is a kind of a break point where things do change. So just wanted to point that out. We have the most current solar costs in the model. We also talked at a high level the last time about, yes, right?
So on the transmission, is that what we would normally call, what we would call wheeling?
No.
So explain what that is.
It's the cost of the actual transmission system infrastructure improvements within JEA's service territory. When we talk about wheeling, that's getting it from outside of territory using other people's transmission lines into the service territory. And those costs, those wheeling costs, those use of external systems, that factors into incremental levels of solar above and beyond this kind of this first tier that we're talking about. So we had a lot of dialogue in November about sort of discrete changes to the model. We talked about the concept of scenarios where we start with building up these different scenarios, changing multiple variables at any given time to account for potential different futures. And those were the 6 scenarios that were discussed back in November. But then we had some discussion about, okay, well, what happens if we start to look at things sort of in isolation? But I think we had some back and forth kind of about load growth, right? What are our load growth assumptions within for JEA from the service territory and customer load growth, and how are those driving our results? So we actually looked at 3 different load sensitivities within one of our scenarios where we said, okay, what if load growth doesn't quite materialize as expected in the current outlook scenario? What if there is no load growth? Basically, where we're at in 2022 for system loads, what if that doesn't change over time? And then finally, at the other end of the spectrum, what if loads increase over time above and beyond what are projected in our base case analysis? So we've got 3 load growth sensitivities. We also looked at the impact of higher fuel prices, natural gas and coal prices. Our base forecast reflects what's going on in the market now, and we all have probably seen enough of the news to understand that the fuel market has been very dynamic the past year or so, to say the least. So we through our scenarios, we've looked at different natural gas and solid fuel prices, but then we also did sensitivity to isolate the kind of the potential impact of the change in fuel prices on its own with no other changes. Similarly, regulated CO2 emissions, we looked at a sensitivity where we've got a cost for carbon emissions. And then we looked at a net zero sensitivity where rather than looking at all the different elements that changed in our net zero scenario, which included changes to fuel prices and costs for carbon emissions, we just looked at, let's not do anything different than what's reflected in the current outlook scenario, but let's get to 0 CO2 emissions by 2050. Dr. Lisa, that starts to kind of address, I think, one of your questions about the difference between the net zero sensitivity and our net zero scenario. And at a high level, the answer to that is there's more going on in the net zero scenario. More variables are changing in the net zero scenario than just the net zero sensitivity. But the only thing we do differently is get to 0 carbon emissions by 2050. Any questions?
Just like follow up on that,
Yeah,
does that then translate into the differences in the costs? That's because of the cost of the extra.
Right, so I think, and Brian helped me out here, we're adjusting these yesterday evening and this morning, but within the net zero scenario, not only are we getting to 0 CO2 emissions, we have a higher fuel price projection, higher fuel prices, coal and natural gas, that are in the net zero sensitivity. And we have a cost for CO2 emissions in the net zero scenario that are not in the net zero sensitivity. So the lows aren't that much different, as you noted. There's different things going on in the model that are related to the cost to serve that load in the form of fuel prices and cost for carbon emissions. And that's, I think, what you're picking up on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
And then you still just have a hard time understanding the difference between scenarios and sensitivities. So you only did the sensitivities to the current outlook scenario, is that correct?
That's
so when you did the regulated CO2 emissions, for example, then you put a cost in for the CO2
Right.
emissions.
That's correct.
And then can you, in 25 words or less, explain why you only do sensitivities?
I'm not going to count words. I'll do my best. The current outlook scenario is not just what's JDA done in the past with no changes. The current outlook scenario reflects the current marketplace for fuel costs. It reflects customer behavior in terms of energy efficiency, demand side management, conservation, electric vehicles, electrification, customer-sided renewables. It reflects the current market for solar, PV, and battery costs with changes moving forward based on industry trends. So when we talk about these different potential futures, the current outlook is sort of representative of what we know now and what we have some confidence is going to be materializing over time based on, what we're seeing right now. We start to develop these other scenarios where we say, okay, what if beyond the current market for fuel prices, for example, where we've got some, increase in coal and natural gas prices over time, if they increase more than expected in combination with other factors. So to look at doing sensitivity analysis within each of the scenarios, it kind of, I'm well past my 25 words, so we're 26, but it gets to be a lot of analysis that's sort of already captured in the scenario. But by doing it on a one-by-one basis as a sensitivity, you can really drill in on what's influencing changes to the model.
Thank you.
Any other questions on this slide? Okay, we'll go to the next slide, please. So, resource additions from our scenario analysis. This is what the model says, right? We'll talk a lot about what we're doing beyond the model, but what we're showing here is to be able to illustrate some commonalities across the scenarios, just purely based on model results. And one thing that's consistent across every scenario and every sensitivity we've done is treatment of 3 existing generating resources. Everything we're looking at reflects Northside 3 retiring in spring 2029. Everything we've looked at reflects the Vogtle 3 and 4 power purchase agreements expiring in the 2044-2045 timeframe. And everything we've looked at reflects the existing purchase, the firm purchase that JDA has for power from NextEra, Florida Power and Light, which expired in the 2042 timeframe. So those 3 changes are embedded in all of the results that we're seeing. Focusing on commonalities and kind of tying this back to what we looked at in November. In November, we were looking at solar photovoltaic or PV additions over time. We sort of focused on the 2030 timeframe as being this near-term next nominally 10-year window or so. Back in November, we also talked about incremental firming natural gas additions that were coming out of the models or commonalities there. And we've expanded it a bit in today's material to talk about the role that battery energy storage might have in JDA's future. So again, just sort of looking at the commonalities, if you start with the incremental solar PV additions shown as cumulative by 2030, we're ranging anywhere from 300 megawatts to 1,275 megawatts of new utility scale solar PV additions. That's what we showed back in November, that it is about 1,275 megawatts by the 2030 timeframe. That's very common across all the different scenarios. But then as you start to look at the additional solar being added between 2030 and 2040, and then again between 2040 and 2050, you start to see some divergence across the scenarios. There's not as many commonalities with the magnitude of solar across the scenarios as you go out further in time. Similarly, but to a little bit lesser extent for energy storage, within the first 10-year window of our planning study across the scenarios, there's some commonalities in terms of not only 200 megawatts up to more than 800 megawatts of solar or battery energy storage maybe being a component of JDA's resource mix. But then as we get out to 2030, 2040, and then 2040 to 2050, that really starts to change depending on which scenario we look at. And then with natural gas, you can see, and again, this is similar to what we showed back in November, on a cumulative basis by 2030, that 570 megawatt resource shows up as a fairly common. And there's one scenario where instead of building that much or adding that much incremental gas, we're looking at a smaller amount, 460 megawatts. But then as we get out to 2030 to 2040 and 2040 to 2050, we really start to diverge and no longer see that common theme, common trend in the magnitude of gas that would be added to the resource mix. Any questions on sliding? Yes, sir.
So, so when you say cumulative 2030, that's for things that are not already committed to. So where is the FPL solar purchase?
The one that was approved a couple of days ago?
Well, it was a couple of weeks ago.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah.
I'll talk about it when, can you hold that question until I talk about the implementation plan?
Just tell me, is it in that 300 or not?
It's all aggregated, right? It's part of all that we're gonna try to do. So yeah, we will add probably 150% percentage of it. And it will be part of it, but not all of it. Right? We're gonna do more, so.
And I think that question that's a little bit challenging to answer in the context of the IRP.
Yeah.
Because that's a 5-year bridge
That's correct.
purchase and we're looking at 20-year PPAs.
That's what I wanted to wait till I talk about it, because we don't wanna call it for the entire horizon, it's only 5 years. We might review it, but at the end of the day, today counts part of what we're doing right near term.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good question.
So just one more thing I'd like to touch on. We talked about energy storage, potential role of energy storage and potential role of solar PV. Looking at the future net zero and the supplemental scenarios, the two rightmost scenarios shown, over time, magnitude of both batteries and solar PV increases, right, as compared to the other scenarios. And that's driven by a couple of factors. One is the PV energy, solar PV, certainly to get to where we're emitting zero carbon is a huge component of the resource mix. But then in order to be able to utilize solar when it's not available, right, during the peak hours of the day, you need to have enough batteries on the system and then enough excess solar to be able to charge those batteries. So I think we touched on this a little bit back in November. I wanted to bring it up again because we are presenting the data in a different manner and the magnitude, the capacity that we're adding from solar PV as well as energy storage. To us, as we prepared this, it jumped out more to us than it did when we were talking in November. So we wanted to make sure we touch on it here. Yes, sir.
Is there a magic ratio there between another future net zero between your PV and your battery storage?
I wouldn't say it's a magic ratio. The battery storage is a mix of storage durations and size of batteries. So there's a lot that really goes into it. But the key aspect is, regardless of the duration of the size of the battery, if we're going to get to net zero, nominally there's 16 hours in a day where, summer it's a little bit less, winter it's a little bit more, where that solar is just not generating. So you need to be able to capture enough of the solar during the hours of the day where it is generating, store it, drain it, cycle it on and on and on. And we could probably do the math to look at exactly how much PV or how much battery you need to capture excess or this excess generation from solar that you need to add to have enough that PV becomes. I don't think we're talking about that yet. Yes.
And so these are, in fact, outputs or results of model runs. Something is being optimized. You're subject to these different constraints.
Yes.
What is being optimized? Is it lowest dollar amount while meeting the constraints, or is it?
Two constraints. So the model first sees reliability, right? Everything needs to meet reliability. And from a there's two elements of reliability. is every response time limited to 25 words? There's two elements of reliability. One is reserve margin, which is kind of like having enough megawatts to meet your demand at any given time, plus a cushion if something goes wrong. The other is unserved energy. So we look in the model and say, okay, if you have a system that for some reason you have enough capacity, but it can't meet the energy requirements within the system, that's not good, right? We need to be able to serve load and keep the lights on. So we look at that sort of outside the model and make sure we have enough generation resources within the model so that we don't have an issue where there's not enough generation to serve load at any given time, recurring over and over and over again. So that's what the model sees first and foremost, is that reliability perspective, and then it's attempting to solve for how do I stay reliable in the least cost manner. So those are the two objective functions, reliability and lowest cost that the model sees. And when we start talking about this, what the model shows, and taking that step to what the model shows to what we're going to be doing, that's where we start to look outside of what the model sees and make the decisions based on the all the discussions we've had.
So this is, within those constraints, this is the lowest dollar amount.
Yes.
That's where we are at this point, and we're gonna go further.
Yes, absolutely.
And particularly, I want to per each scenario, like at step, right? So it allows us to not compare them against each other, like we are able to see is that scenario, we look at its reliability and also its cost, considering also some of the environmental inputs and sensitivities that we are putting in each model, for each one of these scenarios. Does that make sense?
Any other questions from anybody online? I'm not checking to see if hands are being raised. Does anybody?
Someone's checking.
Okay. You can probably go on to the next slide, please. So similar information, but this slide is focused on the sensitivities that were performed, the 6 sensitivities that were outlined earlier. Same things we addressed earlier in terms of Northside 3 being retired in spring of 2029 and the Volvo power purchase agreements dropping off in 24-25 and the Florida Power Line Repair purchase dropping off in the 2022 timeframe, all embedded in these results. And again, we're looking for commonalities here. So this is, now we've looked at 6 different scenarios, 6 different sensitivities. So we've got a total of 12, if you will, cases, or 12 different ways we've looked at the modeling. And similar themes in terms of magnitude of solar PV coming online by 2030 across the different sensitivities. We're seeing some rooms where we've got about 300 megawatts and some rooms where we've got about 1,275 megawatts coming online. As we go beyond 2030, it starts to diverge a little bit. There's less commonality. Energy storage, similar magnitude as we were seeing in the 6 scenarios for the 2030 timeframe, but we start to diverge as we go beyond 2030. And the natural gas, we're seeing similar as what we saw in the scenarios. This, I think we referred to it last time in a little bit more detail, but a 570 megawatt combined cycle resource, which is intended to generate and operate most of the hours of the year. That continues to be common by 2030, and then we start to diverge after 2030 and 2040. So I guess in terms of how the information is presented, it's consistent with the other slide. We're taking away from it from what the model says is consistent with what we saw from the scenarios, and it helps to inform our analysis. And it helps us to figure out, what's the robust resource mix. Now that we've looked at it 12 different ways under a combination of different potential futures and changes to discrete variables. Questions on this slide? Okay, next slide.
So just,
yes.
so when you do the regulated CO2, that's basically a cost for CO2?
That's the cost of CO2, that's right.
I just noticed that there's no difference between that and the current scenario under.
In terms of the resource mix?
Yeah, so it wasn't a number high enough to drive a different decision by the model. I know we're not all those other things, but the model wasn't a big enough number to drive that.
Right, yeah, the model's seeing that with the increased cost imposed by CO2, it still makes sense to have that similar level of solar and new gas. And then, you know, one thing that, to recognize, probably haven't touched on it enough, is when we talk about this new gas resource, it provides a couple of, Mark, I guess you have a question here in a minute. I didn't mean to drag you off there. It provides a couple of benefits to the JDA system. It's new, it's reliable, and it's efficient. So it helps sort of mitigate, to your point, that there's cost of CO2 emissions, and we're able to shift from gas generating units that take this much fuel to operate to something that takes 40% less fuel to operate. That's a benefit to the JDA system in an environment where there's a cost of carbon. The other thing is the flexibility that the new natural gas units provide to allow for more integration of more solar into the resource mix. Mark, did you have a comment?
No, I was just going to say, I think when you look at the cost of CO2, I think well, this is my take on it, right? But the cost per ton of CO2 gets dwarfed by the unserved energy cost. I mean, that would be that's the thing that you're always still like, you could have $1,000 a ton and it's still going to get nuked on the reliability, 1 to 2 reliability hurdles.
Right.
I mean, that's my guess.
So you're saying that if you were, because the cost of CO2 is very high, and you're adding a different resource mix, then you have more unserved energy to deal with.
Yeah.
And the cost of unserved energy is going to be higher because you got to get that energy somewhere else, which is also going to, you wouldn't be the only one paying that cost for CO2. It's going to be in the market somewhere.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's how I look at it.
yeah. Any other questions or comments? Were you raising your hand, clappers? No.
You must have read my mind. I didn't realize I raised my hand. Well, I was just curious in the net zero sensitivity. Is that, if let's say, for example, the leadership decided that, well, we don't want to do net zero, we want to do, net 10, whatever the parameter is. Is it possible to say if we don't reach net zero by 2050, but we reached, a 90% reduction? With all of the, is that tweakable? Is that a number that could be found out by looking at this modeling?
Yes.
And is that something that is a reasonable thing to try to do?
So can I take those questions and kind of separate questions here? Yes, the model can be set up in a way where you specify your CO2 targets. We put in this target for the model to meet, and that goes to Bud's question about what's the criteria in the model. So in this net zero, one of the other criteria besides reliability and cost is telling the model it's got to get to zero carbon emissions by 2050. And we gave it you have to give it a path to get there, right? You can't just go from some level so we give it a path. We can instead say, well, let's get it down to carbon emissions of this many tons or whatever by 2050, give it a path to get there. So you can specify that level and start to analyze how does your resource mix change if you're trying to get to that level. As to whether it's reasonable, I think that sort of factors into what JDA is looking to do moving forward. So I can either defer to Pedro now or take that up.
Let me touch on a couple of things that I think is worth adding to the 25 words, if you don't mind me to, which is, remember, this model shows what we have commercially available today, which means that we have carbon emitting resource that is going to come up in 2040, 2045. So the tool has to replace that, right? Because that is a very long-term future. We might be able to make decisions in the next IRP, right? To be able to restudy and start setting targets on those future years. That's going to get us there, right? The reason the cost is just elevate so quickly is because those resources that are non-carbon emitting just go away around that time frame. Makes it a lot harder. It's a different way to add a little more context to the answer for you. I believe that your thought process in the next IRP will basically help us to set maybe about 95 off 90 and see what it will do in those future years as a study, right? As an analysis that we do as a resource mix started changing. That makes sense. Like, it's definitely something we have discussed, right? What we said, I think it was 40 in renewables, what specific target, and then 100. So that is what is driving these numbers. Particularly in the question about battery storage, right? because those resources go away, immediately the tool is looking for capacity type of resources, and you see a big elevated number. A lot of uncertainty in those future years, but your point is very valid, and you can actually bring them in and see what it does. From a cost, reliability, and environmental impact.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Megan. Any other questions on slide 9?
Before you go to common resources, an opportunity for anyone online to ask questions. I don't know if anyone has posted any questions or have any before.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thanks. Go on to slide 10. So we've talked about what the model says now on 2 slides, so why not one more time? This is sort of the kind of the summary of what was shown in those last 2 slides, or last 2 slides. Pedro, I don't want to steal his thunder here, but Pedro's going to talk a lot about the J2, a lot about, okay, how do we get from what the model says to what we're going to do and what's involved in it? It's more than just decisions. There's other analysis. There's real considerations. But what we're seeing coming out of the model to help kind of inform where we get to next is, I'll talk about timeframes here because we're in early 2023, right? And so 2 years away sounds like a long time, but there's a lot that needs to get done. And we all heard about the supply chain and other things. So some of these timeframes may slip, but the overall mix of resources isn't going to be affected by, 1 year delay in something. So we show battery energy storage in order of magnitude about 150 megawatts in the 2025 timeframe. This first tier of solar, about 300 megawatts of solar in the 2026 timeframe. The firming gas resource coming on in the 2029 timeframe, followed by a fairly large increment of 975 megawatts of additional solar by 2030. So on the previous slides where we said by 2030, there was 1,275 megawatts of solar. That's the 300 in 2026, plus the 975 you see in 2030. Questions on slide 10? Okay, with that, I'll hand it over to Pedro. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit of what we're going to be doing next and some implementation takeaways. But I don't want to go too far without thanking Brad, Andres, Ryan, and Paul, who have been in this journey with us all along. Definitely we appreciate their expertise. They're providing that agnostic view into this, so the process continue providing the value that we're looking for, right? We're looking for an IRP that gives us a portfolio, we can find the commonalities and create some traction on where we're going to go next. So thank you again. We're not done. We continue on. We still have more things to do, but thank you so far. With that, I have a couple of things I want to touch on and talk about some activities that we have in progress, and then I want to do some takeaways of what is the IRP telling JEA from a JEA perspective. With that, if you don't mind, go to the next slide. I got some things I wanted to share. So I'm pretty excited about some of these facts that we have. So we're finalizing the modeling. So here we are. We finalized the modeling to the context of where we are today. We're going to create the IRP report that is going to take place in next steps. I'm pleased to announce that we started an IRP process earlier this week. The 4 sites is actually out there. There's a large population that we are reaching out developers, asking to develop the 4 sites that we have. We're excited about that process, and we are actually evaluating those as PPA, also design and build. Can we actually take a little bit of, take advantage of the IRA changes that occurred that is setting the field for everybody. So we're doing it both ways, and we also know, including solar, we're also including battery storage in it, right? Because the model says that we need to start thinking about battery being part of the solution and portfolio in the near term. So that is out there. The projection that we're putting out there to actually have this sites online is 2026, which is in line with what the IRP is saying. The RFP is going to tell us the reality of it, and I'm looking forward to it. Recently, we have heard about a addition through a PPA of 150 megawatts with FPL that Bud just mentioned. That is 300 plus that. That's kind of where we at right now. 300 plus that number is what we are going to be pursuing right away. For these RFP, I want to highlight the partnership that we have with the Energy Authority. They have expertise in the context of being able to negotiate contracts. So they are assisting us in these RFP processes. You may see the TEA, the Energy Authority involved in the RFP. They actually have done this for other entities. They're doing it for a lot of other entities. They have expertise that we need to leverage, and that is definitely a plus in this process. The next thing I want to talk about, you might answer some questions that were pre-posted. We began a 10 to 12 weeks feasibility process to identify design specifications of a new natural gas combined cycle plant and prepare for an RFP process. It's not an easy endeavor. We want to be ready for it. We want to be informed about what do we need to do. What is this going to lead to is we have the PSC has a process that we have to follow if we were to build a facility like that. We have to be ready and prepared for it. The feasibility process is divided into two phases. One is going to be in the next week or so that is going to help us understand the infrastructure needs if you were to build a gas plant. So we have the appropriate infrastructure, the gas pipelines, all the water systems that need to be included, the ground that needs to be done, structurally how it will be built, the interdependencies, and also establishing the execution baseline. What would it look like for us to be able to go to market, to be able to use that as a comparison point? Followed by that preparation, we also need to start thinking of the Power Plant Siting Act, has some need determination, market test. Market test is when you actually go to the market and see if anyone can actually fulfill our need, right, to ensure that we are being prudent in the process and proceed with that next steps. That's a piece that is moving forward, more to come. I don't think we can say more than we're working through it. And between now and June, we should know a lot more. The last piece, Brett talked about it. The tool doesn't know the topology of our system. The tool doesn't know how big our system is. It knows from a reliability and unserved load perspective what is the most economical, the least economical, and it has some inputs in cost to interconnect some of the facilities, but it doesn't have everything. So we are actually finalized the solicitation process. We are doing the selection process in the next week or so to onboard some professional services to analyze the electrical system, to understand how we integrate these resources in the least cost basis and also on a reliable basis. That is also something we're working through. We have to file a 10-year site plan coming up in April, so we're preparing for that as well. How much information are we able to put out there? We don't know, right? But definitely we are going to be very transparent in this process to share some of the activities that we have as we're validating the actual more pragmatic way to taking what the model is saying into practice, right? Be able to implement it. So those are the key activities that we're moving forward with. Any questions on this before I move with takeaways? I am pretty excited about the fact that we're already in an IRP. I'm sure Ray is excited too, because this is some steps, and I look forward to see what the market is going to be able to tell us in this process. So more to come on that. So stay tuned. I think we all understand what's in IRP. Go to the next slide, if you don't mind. Thank you. You heard me say this before. An IRP is a journey, not a destination. All right. With that said, been reflecting a little bit on what is the model telling us, right? We want to put a more pragmatic view into what that is telling us. We want to provide customers reliable, affordable, uninterruptible energy while being environmental stewards, right? We want to make sure we're doing it in a manner that it reflects where we're going. So some takeaways that I'm sharing here, letting those who haven't seen this before reflect on this graph. To know where you're going, you need to know where you're starting. The starting points, if you look back at 2022, where we were at, you can see on the top graph how we were able to serve with uninterruptible power, with the energy mix that we had. And if you look to the future, near-term future between now and 2030, which is where my mind is today, what I'm going to do between now and then, the potential outlook from net energy services can lead us to have a 9% reduction from 2022 use of coal, that's a positive thing, just the brown color in there. A 33% increase in non-carbon capacity, reaching about 35% of non-carbon emitting resources used by 2030, with a combination of solar and battery systems. That will require about 16 facilities to be built in this time frame that needs to be built. That's a little bit of land that needs to be utilized to build this. We're going to have a higher efficiency natural gas resource that will reduce 4%. Basically, the use of the energy, as you can see, from 58 to 54. An interesting thing here that I want to point out, there's currently in last year's, we had about 28% of our energy was actually purchased from the market, which is a good thing to do, but yet we'll have more optionality longer term to provide controls of fuel cost and passing the cost of access of energy to others. And in fiscal year 22, the CO2 emissions were around 7.0 million. And about 5.7 of that was assigned to the fleet, which is what you see on the bottom here. Here we're projecting a reduction of approximately 35% of that by 2030. That'll get us pretty far, about 2 million reduction, which is 75% from where we started, right? You know where you're going, you need to know where you started. And we started in 2005 with about 15 million tons was assigned to JEA fleet. This is a more pragmatic view. This is not selecting any of the scenarios, right? I'm not selecting the scenarios, but this is a clear message. The model is telling us we need to set in motion to achieve this goal by 2020, 30, or achieve this kind of level of portfolio. We don't know what it's going to look like. It's going to take us some time. And Jay probably will touch on some of that in his remarks. Any questions on this before I go to my last piece I want to share with you today?
The solar generation, what was that ratio for? It's like 3 acres for 1 megawatt. What's that number?
It's 6 to 8.
6 to 8 acres.
6 to 8, megawatt, depending on the technology, which is what I'm going to talk about a little bit next. Technology says a lot in wetlands and position where they had the average. That's pretty much where you have. Good question. All right, let's go next. No questions. This is good. As I was also reflecting, was the IRP telling us past 2030, like 2031 and onward, there's a lot of uncertainty. That is what it's telling me, right? And then I'll put my practical hat, how I'm going to get certainty in an uncertain world. And I realize there's a lot of things that we can actually navigate through. The solar additions go from the 1,250 we just talked about to additional up to 2,475, different scenarios, different circumstances, different costs. The battery additions get up to 7,750. The cost for a battery installation is pretty high. I just want to be upfront, right? Not saying that we should not utilize these resources, but trying to get 7,750 is something that we need clarity. And when I talked about it, when I was answering your question, is because he's trying to replace some things that aren't going to expire, so he's finding a replacement. So I think we know the why we're seeing that uncertainty. We just don't know exactly the commonalities to know the answer, how to compensate for that removal of those resources in 45, 43, 45, 46. And that's probably something we'll be able to study more longer term. Yes.
I'm sorry to back us up a little bit, but I think Brad touched on it a little bit, but it wasn't addressed in the last slide about sort of the general consensus around battery storage by 2030. Could you touch on that again? Did something jump out?
Consensus in regards to how much of it? Mm-hmm. Just go back one slide if you want. So the 75 of having solar, in the way we have gone in the PPA includes battery in it. So we wanna consider it, and we're going to look to see the 150 that the model is saying. It's included in the 1250, that a good way to say it. So when I look at it, I don't look at it just as solar, I see it as a package right now, because it's probably the most practical, more realistic way that this is gonna play out. Does that make sense?
I think so, and I think I heard you say it was a 150 megawatt, which was sort of for batteries.
That is correct. This is one thing, the combination, I think the Stan was asking the question of the ratio. We just don't know what that looks like in practice, right? So is it 25 what we should start with? Is it 50 and we could get adding? We don't know that for sure, and that's what system studies are gonna help us to get there. Very good question. Thank you for bringing it back to that.
Thank you.
Because battery is part of this. I'm just trying to illustrate a little bit of what we are. Excellent. Go next. As I was just reflecting a little bit on some of these things, in context, we talked about the current outlook. We talked about a lot of the current outlook, and I don't want to make it clear, that's not a stagnation. That means we're accepting realities as we know, okay, is a good point. But when we look at the cost of that current outlook compared to the other areas, we're talking about a delta of about $15 to $20 billion range, right? Particularly to 2050. I'm not saying that we're picking a particular scenario. What I'm saying we have to actually look at, is a $15 to $20 billion range actually acceptable and a cumulative cost for all the customers? I don't know the answer to that, but as we get closer to the implementation plan in the near term, we're gaining ground to validate whatever most cost-effective solutions longer term. But it's important that I mention that we really need to do more work. That's my next step, right? There's more studies needed to better inform the long-term plan. We have some certainty short-term, but we have some more work to do. I want to share a few things that I was able to look into, commercially available options. Things that are not available today, they might not be available in 2030. I know that. I'm an engineer by trade, so I know by the fact that there are some things that are actually evolving, and we might be able to add it as an optionality. That'll take that cost that I just talked about and shrink it down. I don't know that today, but I'm sure it's going to happen. We're open to other commercially available solutions that we know out there. Carbon capture is evolving. Hydrogen is evolving. Small modular reactors it's evolving. It's there, right? We're getting closer. It's not commercially available, so it's not a current option, but we're definitely not saying that this is the only way to do it. Is it shorter term? I think for the next 7 years, definitely is. We have some market trends. Volatility on products. We know that supply chain is an issue. We recognize that access to modules to be able to do inverter-based technology is an issue. There are plants that are being built in the US, but are not enough to be able to support the demand that exists out there. So we're going to be competing. We're not the only ones that want to move in this direction. So it's important that we recognize these market trends are also going to be affecting 2030 and onward, and we want to make sure we're preparing ourselves for it. Electric system integration. I had a conversation this morning with Ricky. We're talking about the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has some open orders out there. They're getting comments on seasonal type of seasonal versus hourly adjustments to load profiles and how that is managed. That is not decided on, but that could be a regulatory change that actually either enable or make things a little harder in 2030 and 40. That may affect us. It doesn't affect us directly from a jurisdictional perspective, but those are active things that are happening in the market and in our industry that may impact this. But you touched on something, I'm glad you brought it up because it reminded me to talk about this, the point-to-point transmission, bringing things, wheeling things into the system. The cost models significantly are impaired by this wheeling at the economics of it. Is there a solution for low capacity factors to bring something like solar and be able to wheel it because it's not always available? Like the current rules to be able to bring power from other areas does not support a economical solution. It doesn't mean that we should not pursue them, but longer term, we want to see some changes on that to make sure the transmission prices get actually adjusted, so it actually enables these technologies, right? This that I'm talking about, the one I'm talking here, to come from other places at a right cost. That's been the works. That's not, we don't have a clear picture on it, right, Ricky? But we know that there's momentum. We know that environmental regulations are changing as well. We know that we have to be sensitive to that. We'll continue monitoring this from an emissions perspective. There's Kevin is in the back here. We've been talking about some of how the what if scenarios so we can be informed. So any decisions that we're doing short term are taking into consideration some of the dynamics of these environments. But anything beyond 2030, we don't know it, right? So we're definitely going to have more certainty in the next time that we do an IRP, which is what I'm going to close with. Within the next, an IRP in the 3 to 5 years to provide us these alternatives. The reason I'm bringing all these thoughts on my takeaways is in the journey that we're in, we know where we're going near term. We have more work to do longer term. Now we're going to focus on executing the activities that were started, continue having the conversation, and getting ready for the next IRP, and continue on that year-over-year analysis of this process to get the best resources added to our system. Any questions? Yes.
So when you're looking at market trend, you're looking at PPAs. I'm assuming you looked at virtual PPAs, and once you start doing that, you might as well just look at outright REC purchases. So from a capital standpoint, buying a 20-year, 200 megawatt an hour REC PPA, right, is probably less capital intensive and still gets, helps accomplish the goals that other folks here at the table are looking for. Is there, is JA got an axe to grind on, like, we need, they want iron on the ground, or is it whatever the cost is? Because the cost of RECs outside of what I've seen here are significantly less than the Florida footprint.
So it's a great question, because the RFP that we just sent out includes that topic of the daily transfer rate, and also includes a PPA for which we have the option to buy. Basically, set it as a PPA and buy it at the end of the term. So we're looking at it from a financial perspective, from a liability perspective. So that's how it is set up. So I don't have a definite answer on what it's going to look like, but we are actually, the RFP that was sent out, it does include RECs and how they are going to be transferred, moved around, whether in a PPA, and also if we were to just have a developer and we own it, all that transactions, it's part of the RFP. So very good question. Is that affirmation that we are thinking what matters most to the stakeholders. So. Any other questions?
So, I know I'm just getting slow. So back on, so page 10 of your slides, is that a recommendation that falls out of this IRP?
So basically this is the common resources. What it's telling you is this is what is the common resources in form of it deterministic. So yes, it's a recommendation that we pursue to be able to add this to our
final recommendation though. This is the model.
The model
says.
The model says.
This is the most common, and we're going to cover how do we get from. The model says to recommendation.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. That helps?
Now I've done my whole
Now we got
All right, thank you. If there are any additional questions, just let us know anyone online. With that, I think it was a good question for Jay. You already answered it. We have next steps and open discussion with Jay.
Okay. Am I going now?
Yes.
Thank you. First of all, I want to be sure that we recognize, and you all can verify that we recognize Marty Lanahan before she got here, because she's our vice chair of our board, and I didn't want her to not be recognized as she walked in. Do you
I
want to say
would
anything?
love to.
Okay.
Do you mind?
No,
And I.
we're not going to change the slide though.
No, there's no need to. I apologize, I was late. We were concluding, I'm on the board of the Jesse Ball DuPont Fund, and we were concluding our retreat, and we concluded with a site tour, hence the boots, of the Lift Every Voice and Sing Park near the JTA site. So if you haven't driven by there, it's going to honor the James Weldon Johnson and his brother. It's really cool, so check that out. I just wanted to have an opportunity, and thank you, Jay, for when I asked, when are they meeting? He actually gave me the dates and said, and you can come, so thank you. I wanted to thank everybody who's in this room and on the phone and who's been part of this process. The last time I was on the JEA board, we didn't have a process like this. We were not operating in an environment where we candidly wanted and needed and felt like we needed your feedback. And one of the commitments of the board and one of the reasons we hired Jay was a commitment to the community for utmost transparency. So I just wanted to take this opportunity as we start moving into, at some point, but there is going to be a recommendation, and we're moving to that recommendation, and that recommendation will be sent to the board. Y'all know more about this process, candidly, than the board does right now. You've been educated on what you're doing in a way that we talk about it a lot. It came up a lot in our evaluation of ourselves that we can't wait to get the IRP information. So, you know, I know you audit, a lot of you audit all of our board meetings. We just haven't had a chance to really talk about it because we're waiting for you to do your work. So I really appreciate all of your hard work because it's not easy. I also am hopeful. The one thing I'm very excited about hearing was next IRP, 3 to 5 years. Next IRP, 3 to 5 years. I think I heard it 8 times since I walked in the room. And I just am hopeful that all of you will be part of that process as well. And this is a commitment from the board. I think I'll be board chair in 3 years if this whole thing works out, that we will be reconvening. This is a baseline IRP. We will assess it. And the reason we need to assess it, and Pedro has addressed it, there's so much emerging technology that we can capitalize on. Ray and Laura and I and a bunch of the women at the JEA went to the Florida Women in Energy Conference in Tampa a month ago. And there were a couple of presenters who presented this great technology, and I am passionate about solar. So I went running up to this guy, and I'm like, oh, I'm a board member for the JEA, because we've already talked to the JEA. We're in pilot in 2 locations, and when we finish our pilot, we're coming to the JEA, because they can help solve that problem. That technology is in pilot today. But next IRP, I'm hopeful that that technology will be available and we can buy it off the shelf, because I don't know if you know anything about the JEA, but y'all own it. And we don't have a huge R&D department that's out there trying to create innovation. We kind of have to buy it off the shelf. And I believe there's going to be a lot of technology available to help us in the future. But the baseline work is really, really, really important. And all of you have been doing a lot of heavy lifting. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for that. I hate that I came late. I also am going to announce in advance that I'm going to leave a little early. I'm meeting with a bunch of people in the community and some JEA staff to help us help some of the folks in our community who can't help weatherize their houses. So we're hopeful that we'll be announcing a pilot soon where we've got some community funders partnering with the JEA expertise to help the folks who are less fortunate, and who, if we just did a couple of little things around insulation and windows, we could save a lot of the grid draw and also help them save as much as $40 to $50 a month in their electric bill. And we've got all this data, so I'm super excited about that meeting, but that's it too. So I will leave early if you haven't finished. Hello. Any questions? Do you get how much we appreciate all this work? Because it's a lot of work. I mean, it really is a lot of work. This is not one and done. So we appreciate everything you're doing. Thank you. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you. So it's interesting, this process. I think we started, and I may have talked a little bit about this in one of the first meetings, but 8 years ago, some number of years ago, I had the opportunity, and Ted Phillips is our CFO, we both had the opportunity to sit in the seats that you're sitting in on the working group. I don't remember what we called it, but doing this for TVA, where I was one of the stakeholders. And then 4 or 5 years ago, so Ted's online and Laura Dutton is online. 4 or 5 years ago, Laura Dutton and I, while we were working at TVA, helped facilitate the IRP working group for TVA then, and Laura Shepis was one of the people that sat in your seat then. And so I just earlier today talked to Sheila Presley, who's our chief customer officer, and I said, sometimes when you're talking to a customer who happens to be upset, and I don't think you all are, but if you're talking to a customer and you start to explain how you sat in their seat, they really don't care. So you might not care about that, but I do think it's important to know that we have been trying to listen because we've also been in the seat too, and we've gone through this process with you. Next steps, you asked, was the slide that was up here, was that the answer? Was that the recommendation? And really it is not the recommendation yet. It is the most common output across what was 6 scenarios and then 6 sensitivities and then lots of runs of the scenarios in there to be able to come with that. So that provided us with what I would call is when we do rate, so we talk about it being an art and a science. What I would call this is most of the science behind here. So the math behind the work that we need to do. Now we have to put in a little bit more information to figure out what the right answer is. And that we have to focus on how we just talked about, we're trying to help some people in the community that might need help. It's our job to be able to provide affordable rates. That's not just for the 25-30% of the community that has trouble paying their bill, but it is also for economic development. How do we keep rates affordable to support economic development? How do we also stay focused on our sustainability? We have to make sound business decisions along the way with every one of these decisions as we keep on moving through this. So we got to have affordable rates. We have to think about sustainable resources. So that's what falls out of this. We have to have reliability, because if we don't keep it running, it doesn't matter what the source is. We have to have reliability. We're listening to you and other groups about what the community expectations are, and we've got to be resilient. The world is changing around us, and we've got to be resilient and ready for that. We don't use the words that often within JEA, but we have to look at both the social justice, the environmental justice, that comes back into the sustainability. How do we put all of those things in a package and take the math? Because the reality is we still have to get the electricity. We've got to get the energy to our customers and look at all of that. So the recommendation that will go to the board, we'll work on that over the next couple of months. In a May timeline, I think Laura Shepis is going to talk about what time, but the May timeline, June timeline, we will have a recommendation. So on the list, it had 35% non-carbon emitting in 2030. So is that the goal? I don't know if that's the goal. Yeah, I've had some debate. Y'all can help me. This is absolutely not the most important thing, but a goal and a target. We're trying to decide which one is one. I think we should have a target early. That's easy for us to kind of look at. So what is the target by 2030? The supplemental one and some of the requests from some of the groups has said 30% of renewable by 2030. What we've got in the model right now is about 35% non-carbon emitting. Is that the right target? What should the goals be for 2050? One of the things that I want to be sure of is that we don't take liberties with that. We could put a goal. We could put a goal out there. But if we didn't think it was real, if we didn't think we could actually kind of go in that direction, then I don't feel like that's the right thing. Because if we're gonna be transparent, if we're gonna be open and communicate, then I wanna be sure that we're also thoughtful about that. Pedro talked about new technologies. So is hydrogen the right answer? Small modular nuclear, more batteries? There are things that haven't been tested all the way out for us to say. So we have to have some sort of a goal with the caveats of, we're gonna do this again in 3 or 4 years, and again in 3 or 4 years, to keep on. We did one of the scenarios as a economic downturn, and that even with an economic downturn, we continue to grow like we've been growing. We'll have 1 million customers. Right now, we have 510,000 electric meters. By the end of this, we'll have 1 million customers. That's just the normal steady growth that we've had over the last 20 years. If we do that for the next 30 years, we'll be at 1 million customers. So we have to be able to create goals that will stretch us, but that are achievable for that 2050 to be able to commit to what we need to work for. One of the requests has been how these other cities in Florida have made promises about renewable. We can't commit for the city, but we can commit for our own purposes. We have we use a lot of electricity on our water system, our pump stations. Right here, I'm a little cold right now. We're using electricity to keep us cool. We can commit sometime in that mid-2035 range that we can use renewable energy for all of our stuff. So we can put that in there. But then we have to have a plan that's a real, legitimate, actionable plan, because between now and 2030 to do even the things that are showing up as least cost on the model is a really, really heavy lift for us to do this and do it well and do it right. All of the models have Northside Unit 3 coming offline by that 2030 timeline. Correct. I got halfway in that sentence. I want to check.
Yep.
All of them have that coming offline. What is the right answer for Northside Unit 1 and 2? The models are saying they should be there for reliability purposes for a long time. The next IRP and the next IRP are the types of things that's when we'll be able to make those decisions, because the next IRP is not going to go to 2050. The next IRP is going to 2055. So we'll keep on stretching out. Early on, we talked about having these kind of 3 different kind of components. We're going to look at short term for the first 10 years, then the middle 10 years, and the last 10 years. These first 10 years, I think, are going to be very active. We're going to look at the right answer, and then we're going to need support from you all continuing beyond now. And I'm not suggesting that we need 100% cheerleader, be right behind us. Everything we're doing is exactly right. Keep challenging us. Keep giving us pushing us to be sure we're making good decisions. But no matter what we end up recommending, there's going to be a significant amount of transmission that's going to be required. That's going to be transmission that's outside of Duval County. It's going to be transmission inside of Jacksonville, Duval County. And that's going to require a lot of work across all sorts of groups and agencies to be able to make that work well, for us to keep those goals that we'll stretch to, make those real. So I between now and that May, June timeline, we'll put together a recommendation that goes to the board. That will have goals and targets and plans and promises and actionable steps that we can take to be able to move forward, to keep on supplying energy and utility services. Because everything we do, when we talk about this, we're foundational to the community, and everything we do allows everyone else to do their jobs well. It's not a one size. We can't do the way we've done it in the past. Marty, I appreciate that you pointed out the last time you were on the board, we didn't do that real open, get as much input from the public. We did a water IRP. And the first time we met, I think I've told you this before, the first time we met with the Riverkeeper was after we finished that water IRP. So we're doing this different now. That was just 3 years ago. So we're doing this different to get this input. I think we're better for the input, and I think that we are going to end up with something that is directionally what we need to do to be able to serve the community. But I appreciate the input that you've given, and I want to open the floor now, the open discussion time. Are there other questions, comments, concerns? Say nice things about us in front of Marty. Things like that.
How do you consider the non-quantifiable, so the things that you mentioned and then like emissions beyond the required levels of air and water and you know, CO2, which is not regulated. How do you take into account the risk and the risk of fuel prices and all that kind of stuff? In this next 2 months, how do you do that? How do you,
some of those are quantifiable and those are modelable.
well, you get the number, but what is the value, I guess, is the.
That's a good question. That is going to come back to what we're hearing. And part of that is that list of things that we're talking about. What I said, as if it was a number, we're focused on affordable rates. How do we measure that? We have to measure that based on what other people are doing, where we are in our community, and how we're serving the overall community. There's not a single number that if I have this one, I'm affordable. If I don't, then we're not. That's kind of the focus. So some of these things there is some feel to. That's the art part, the science and the art. You said, how do we measure emissions that are beyond?
Value would be better.
How do we
I
value?
know how to measure it.
How do we value emissions beyond the required? We meet emissions. It could be controversial for me to say this, but I think we're maybe the most important environmental group within this community because we've already treated the water way above and beyond the standard. We're already treating the air quality way above and beyond the standard. We are already serving the community and meeting many of these goals, but we have to have reliability and resiliency that provide value. If we're reliable and resilient, then that's the value.
That's one of your constraints is you'll meet the environmental regulations. I didn't mean
Okay.
above, I meant doing better than how do you value? And that's just one of the.
What I'm saying is we're already above.
Resilience and
Yeah.
how do you value?
I'm saying we're already above environmental standards. Everything that we're doing.
I'm with you on that.
And we're already above environmental standards, and we're talking about how do we go beyond that. And we will, quite frankly, not get far enough for some of you in the room and too far for others of you in the room. And affordable rates, some people call us every single day and tell us we don't have affordable rates. And we still are economic engine for the community, so.
I think I'm going to follow up on Bud's question a little bit is how I think focuses on the planning process from here on out by the leadership. And it's not, we all know JEA's really good record in terms of meeting regulations and things like that. I'm not sure we can all say that, for example, removing all coal petcoke is not going to be a public health benefit. Some of us feel, and it's not going to be, withdrawing those water discharges, there will be an environmental benefit to moving away. There'll be. So those are sort of externality costs.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, are these the things that are going to be? We named them. You named them early on in that in February last year.
Yeah.
Slideshows about how these sort of soft considerations were going to be incorporated ultimately. And it's, I guess, my understanding that now is that time. As you see what the models say, you see what the quantifications say, and now it's up to the leadership to decide, okay, what do we do with all of those other factors, the community input and things like that. First of all, Bud, did I catch what you were trying to say? And,
Well, I think that if we had started, and said that we think the model is gonna show 35% non-carbon emitting by 2030, I think that some of the engineers would have said, oh, not. With this, our lease cost is gonna be less than that. I think we're moving in that direction, and pieces of this have already been put into that, and that to get us kind of a foundation to start from. I'm also, the trick really, I believe the trick becomes how we move past even the 2030 timeline. How do we focus on the most important things, get the big stuff knocked out of the way, so that then we can add to that incrementally and be stronger and better. If we do that well, then we have between 2030 and 40 and 2040 and 2050, we have the ability to do, the right. Yeah, I guess it's this might get a little bit off track a little bit, but it's you fill the jar up and we're putting the big rocks in, and then we have room to put the smaller rocks in later. That's what we have to do. It's got to be incremental steps in the process, quite frankly. So we're getting some big steps. We're saying unit 3 comes offline, but we've been saying unit 3 is coming offline. It's been in the 5th year of the 5-year plan for 34 years? No, that's an exaggeration.
Real long, real long.
Can I touch on something?
Yep.
That might be helpful to put in context. Using North Side 1 and 2 as an example, the coal units. Pedro put up a slide. It's there for capacity and reliability, but we collectively JDA, we're pushing away from utilizing those units. So while those are still there, and we talk about, it's really difficult to differentiate between what's a megawatt and what's a megawatt hour. You keep it there to meet the megawatts at any given time, but you're not running the units very often. And that was illustrated in the graphic. Look at what we've done since 2005 when we had Power Park online and Shear 4, coal unit out of Georgia, and Northside 1 and 2, all of which were running at very high levels. And then you look at this chart and say, just by 2030, now we're talking about continuing emergence of different technologies for future IRPs. Just by 2030, the proportion of your load served by coal and petcoke is going down to 3%. So the units are there, and I know that the optics, so they're still operating, but they're not operating very often. So we are taking steps to reduce that, and it's reflected in the modeling. It's just, I really get that unless we say, oh, those units are being demolished, that to the community, that they're still there, but they're not being utilized very much. And I think that's really important that we look at the transition away to reliably serve them. Yes, Kevin?
Yeah, I don't environmental rules and regs continue to respect down on those type of emissions and everything. And we're waiting on the new CO2 rules coming out in April, proposed rules, and it comes out of the new sources. So if any new sources we put up, we're going to have to meet those emission regs, but also existing sources. And so we're going to have to meet those. So at some point in the future, even with this model, and once again, we're in the context of now, present, what can we do? And on this combined cycle that we keep showing, there's about a 6-year lag time for us. It takes about 18 to 24 months to permit it, and then it takes 3 to 4 years to build it. So we just can't wait, how we're going to supply future generation if we keep waiting to see something. So right now, in this IRP, I think it's showing that that's what we need to do. But in the future, in 1 to 3 years, could be something different. And so we just have to kind of work in the present and plan for the future and be that adaptable, flexible to keep doing this process so that we can change if we need to. Because something better is going to come along, and we all know it. Solar panels will get more efficient. They'll come with batteries built in. Could all of a sudden the 6 to 8 acres we need now is 3 to 4 acres. Just a lot better efficiency. So we just got to keep waiting for the technology to catch us.
Kevin, also, I appreciate the intent. He sped up the length of time it takes to do the combined cycle by 1.5 years. So it might take a little longer than what he just said, in case anyone's writing that down. we are, gonna, keep on staying focused on this update. The real key here is that every 3 or 4 years, we've got to revisit what this is, and what the right answer is for us, because all the inputs will change. Like Kevin talked about environmental inputs, growth inputs, expectations and technology is going to change. And then we're going to keep on moving forward. So I appreciate y'all's time, not just today, but for the last year. And then we will meet again. And I don't remember what I'm so tired of the water.
Okay, we're at meeting 7. We're gonna have our 8th meeting. Please hold in dark pencil on your calendars, May 25th from 5:30 to 7. Venue, I'm so close to being able to tell you. I think I can tell you tomorrow, but here's our pledge. It will be downtown, it will be centrally located, it will be easy for folks to get to. It will be open to the public so that the public can come in and hear our dialogue. So I anticipate some thank yous, public thank yous to all of our stakeholders, some framing remarks, very simple presentation of the journey that we've gone on, and then a panel discussion that will be crafted in coordination with you as stakeholders so that all the voices are represented. And at that point, after that point, we're going to continue the community conversation into June, July, with even more smaller, but equally accessible public conversations that we hope you will also be able to participate in. So I'm happy to take any questions about that plan or feedback on that. One more time, that's May 25th, downtown Jacksonville, 5:30 to 7. And Rosemary will be pushing out that invite with those details and the venue by the end of the week. Okay, thank you again for coming.